On the afternoon of April 1st, 1988, an 8-year-old girl named April Marie Tinsley walked east on Hogland Avenue in Fort Wayne, Indiana, wearing pink sneakers and carrying a small canvas backpack. It was Good Friday. The sky was the flat, pale gray of late Indiana winter, and the trees along the road had not yet fully decided to become spring. Somewhere behind her, the smell of a holiday meal drifted from the open window of her family's house. Somewhere ahead of her, her aunt's house waited a few blocks away. She never arrived. When investigators returned to Hogland Avenue that evening, they found one of her pink sneakers sitting upright at the edge of the road, still laced as if its owner had simply stepped out of it and continued on without it. The other shoe was never found. That single sneaker, sitting perfectly upright on a curb in the late afternoon light of a Good Friday in northern Indiana, is one of the most precisely wrong images in the history of this case. Not knocked over, not scattered, upright, as though placed. 3 days later, April's body was recovered from a drainage ditch in rural DeKalb County, 20 miles east of where she was last seen. She was 8 years old. The investigation that followed would last, in fits and starts, for 30 years. For 3 decades, the Fort Wayne Police Department worked the case with the tools they had. They canvassed neighborhoods, distributed composite sketches, fielded hundreds of tips, tested what science would allow, and waited. They were also, for 30 years, being watched. The man who killed April Marie Tinsley did not disappear into silence. He chose to communicate. In 1990, a message appeared scrawled in crayon on a barn wall in rural Indiana. The writing was deliberate, the grammar was mocking, and it referenced a detail about the missing shoe that no member of the public had ever been told. In 2004, notes written by the same hand began appearing under the seats of young girls' bicycles in local neighborhoods, accompanied by biological material that investigators collected and preserved, but could not immediately trace. Each taunt was evidence. Each piece of evidence sat in a sealed bag, waiting for a science that did not yet exist. The Fort Wayne Police Department never closed the case, but the case went quiet. The file moved from the active rotation to the basement shelf, to the cold case unit, to the long institutional patience of a department waiting for forensic technology to catch up to what investigators already believed. One detective carried April's file in the part of his mind where unresolved things wait, not obsessively, not sentimentally, but with the particular stubborn attention of a man who has made a private accounting of what he still owes. The accounting would eventually be paid. In the summer of 2018, working from a forensic genetic genealogy match built from a DNA profile extracted across multiple taunting communications left over 3 decades, investigators in Allen County collected a set of used condoms from the residential trash can at a property on a quiet street in Graybill, Indiana. They did not need a warrant. The condoms were in a bin at the curb, available to collection, the same as anyone's discarded mail or empty bottles. What they contained was a complete genetic profile. It matched to a probability of 98%, confirmed by 2 independent laboratories, every biological trace April Marie Tinsley's killer had left behind over 30 years of taunting the people who were looking for him. To understand what those condoms contained and what it cost April's family to wait 30 years for the answer, we have to return to Fort Wayne. We have to return to a Good Friday afternoon, a pale gray sky, a child walking east on Hogland Avenue, and a single pink sneaker sitting upright at the edge of a road, as though its owner had simply stepped out of it and kept walking. She had not kept walking. Before we go back to April 1st, 1988, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe cold cases deserve a second look, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The light in Fort Wayne, Indiana on the first day of April 1988 was the kind of light that couldn't quite commit. It had arrived that morning pale and thin through clouds that hadn't decided whether to break or thicken, and it lay across the southeast side of the city, with the flat provisional quality of a late winter afternoon that was pretending to be spring without yet earning the right. The temperature was in the mid-40s. Along Hogland Avenue, the oak trees that lined the modest residential streets stood bare except for the first faint swelling of buds at the branch tips, a concession to the calendar rather than to any actual warmth. The neighborhood where April Marie Tinsley lived was a working-class residential stretch of modest frame houses, set back from the road behind chain-link fences and short driveways. Some yards had early snowdrops, white and small, pushing up along the house foundations. A few houses still had storm windows in. There was a Pontiac Firebird in the driveway of the house 2 doors down from the Tinsley home, its hood up, A man in a flannel jacket leaning into the engine with a socket wrench. And the small, steady sounds of his work, the click and ratchet, the soft metallic ring of a tool set down on concrete, carried clearly in the still air. From a window somewhere on the block, an AM radio played the preseason baseball coverage that had been running since morning, a voice rising and falling with the easy cadence of a game that didn't count yet, the sound mixing with the smell of cooking that had been building in the Tinsley house since mid-morning. It was Good Friday. In the kitchen, April's mother had been at the stove since before noon. The meal was a modest, traditional one. The smell of fish frying in a cast-iron pan, cornbread warming in the oven, the sharp sweet vinegar scent of pickled beets opened from a jar. The kitchen window above the sink was fogged at the corners with cooking steam, and the linoleum floor was warm from the heat of the oven. A paper bag from the IGA on South Calhoun sat folded and set aside on the counter, the receipt still tucked in its fold. April had been in and out of the kitchen all morning, drawn by the smell and by the proximity to her mother, and had eaten a piece of cornbread, standing at the counter, talking with her hands the way she did, explaining something that had happened at school the previous week, with the animated completeness of a child who treated all information as equally important and equally worth conveying. She was 8 years old. She had been 8 since December. April Marie Tinsley was a small girl, lightly built, with dark hair cut to her shoulders, and the particular physical quality that some 8-year-olds have of seeming both entirely childlike and somehow already more themselves than adults, twice her age. A completeness of personality rather than a precocity of manner. She laughed easily. She was curious about machinery and about weather. She kept a collection of flat stones on her bedroom windowsill, sorted by color. She had an aunt she was fond of, her mother's sister, who lived several blocks away on North Anthony, and she walked to that house often enough that the route was unremarkable. On the afternoon of April 1, she dressed to go. The pink sneakers went on first. Canvas Nikes, pink with a white swoosh, size 2, purchased in February and still relatively new, with the laces tied in the double knot her mother had insisted on since the autumn when April had tripped on a loose lace on the school steps. Over her jeans and sweatshirt she pulled a light jacket, zip front, the lavender one that had been her Christmas gift and that she wore with the self-conscious satisfaction of a child who knew she looked good in it. The small canvas backpack went over both shoulders. It was pale blue, slightly overstuffed with the indeterminate contents that accumulate in a child's bag over a school week. A library book, with the slip still tucked in it, 2 pencils, a folded drawing of a horse she'd made during afternoon study hall, a half-eaten roll of Necco wafers, and a small brass key on a string that went to nothing in particular, but that she had found and kept on principle. Her mother called after her from the kitchen doorway. The exchange was brief and ordinary. Be careful, don't be late. It's going to get cold again before dinner. April raised a hand without turning around. She went out the front door. The storm door closed behind her, with its characteristic sound, the hydraulic exhale of the closer mechanism, the brief tick of the latch. Her footsteps crossed the porch and descended the 3 concrete steps to the front walk. At the gate in the chain-link fence, she turned right, east, and started up Hogland Avenue. The route she intended to walk was not a long one. From the Tinsley house to her aunt's place on North Anthony was perhaps 6 blocks, dependent on the exact path taken. And the path April typically took ran east along Hogland for several blocks before cutting north through the residential grid. Most of the route was on sidewalk. Most of the route passed in front of houses with windows that faced the street. But there was a stretch, perhaps a block and a half in length, where the character of the road changed, where a vacant lot on the south side created a gap between houses, where a drainage swale ran alongside the road, and the chain-link fencing was set back or absent, where the natural sightlines from nearby windows were interrupted by the angle of a garage, the height of a hedge, the simple geometry of a neighborhood not designed for safety, but for function. It was along this stretch that the last person who remembered seeing April Tinsley alive, a neighbor, an older woman who had been turning over soil in her front flower bed, placed her, walking east, her pink sneakers moving steadily on the sidewalk, her lavender jacket just visible against the gray of the afternoon. The woman would later say that she had watched April for a moment, the way one watches a child one knows in passing, not with concern, just the reflexive adult notice of a small person moving through a familiar space. And then she had gone back to her garden. That was the last confirmed sighting. The time was approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. What happened after that point on Hogland Avenue has never been observed by any surviving witness. What is known is that at some point on that stretch of road, in that gap between windows, In that brief interruption of sightlines where the sidewalk ran closest to the swale, April Marie Tinsley encountered someone. The someone had a vehicle. This much could be inferred from what came next. 20 miles of distance do not happen on foot, and no credible witness placed April anywhere between Hogland Avenue and DeKalb County in the days between her disappearance and her discovery. Whatever happened, happened quickly. Whatever happened, happened in a place where no window faced the street. The neighbor finished turning her flower bed. The bare soil was dark with early season moisture and had the heavy agricultural smell of thaw, iron and organic matter, and the faint trace of last year's mulch decomposing beneath. She went inside. The afternoon light, already thin, began to lose what little warmth it had carried. On the sidewalk of Hogland Avenue, in the space where April had been walking, there was nothing. The road was empty. The bare trees stood along the curb with their half-formed buds. The sound of the socket wrench 2 doors down had stopped. Somewhere to the west, in the kitchen of a frame house on Hogland Avenue, the oven was still warm and the Good Friday meal sat on the stove, and nobody had called yet to say she wasn't coming. April's mother made the call to the Fort Wayne Police Department at 7:14 in the evening. The meal had gone cold on the stove. 2 phone calls to the aunt's house on North Anthony had confirmed what the family already feared. April had not arrived. She had not arrived, and no one had seen her come. And it had been more than 3 hours since she had walked out the front door of the house on Hogland Avenue in her lavender jacket and her pink sneakers with the double-knotted laces. 3.5 hours by the time the aunt picked up the phone. 4 hours by the time a patrol car turned onto Hogland Avenue and the officers stepped out onto the curb. The responding officers noted the time, noted the route, and began working outward from the house in the standard pattern for a child missing on foot in a residential area. The neighborhood search that began that evening was not yet officially a crisis. 8-year-old children occasionally wander, occasionally lose track of time, occasionally accept a ride from a family acquaintance, and fail to communicate the change of plans. The patrol officers knew this, and they conducted the first hours of the search with the practiced combination of efficiency and quiet worry that is the professional signature of people who have worked missing child calls long enough to know that the first hours matter more than any subsequent hours, and who have also worked them long enough to know that knowing this does not always help. They canvassed the block. They knocked on the door of the neighbor who had been gardening. She came out onto her porch, still in her outdoor shoes, and told them what she had seen: the child walking east, the lavender jacket, the time, the last visible position on the sidewalk. She pointed. An officer noted the exact location in his pad, drew a short diagram of the sightline gap she had described, and circled it. They walked that stretch of sidewalk in the dark, with flashlights. They checked the drainage swale. They walked the adjacent vacant lot. They found nothing that evening, not because nothing was there, but because the dark and the conditions and the available resources were what they were, and because the one piece of evidence that Hogland Avenue had yielded, the single pink sneaker, found by a second officer working 100 yards east of the last sighting, sitting upright on the curb near the gap between the vacant lot and the next house, had been photographed, bagged, and logged without anyone yet understanding what it meant. The sneaker was right-footed, still laced in a double knot, sitting upright on the curb's edge, heel to the asphalt, toe pointing skyward in a posture that corresponded to no natural fall or tumble. An officer photographed it from 3 angles before bagging it. He wrote in his notes, shoe, child's, pink canvas, size 2, right foot, laces intact, no apparent damage, position upright, curb east of vacant lot approximate, 100 eats from last sighting. He assigned it the evidence code E8801 and sealed the bag. He stood there for a moment, after he sealed it, looking at the place on the curb where it had been. The street was quiet. The flashlight beam swept across wet concrete and the bare lower stalks of a roadside shrub and the glitter of fine quartz in the asphalt. There was no second shoe. There was no backpack. There was no lavender jacket. There was the curb, the dark, the smell of cold and wet concrete, and the absence of an 8-year-old girl who had been walking east 3 hours earlier. The overnight search found nothing further. By morning of April 2, the case had been elevated and additional resources were committed. By the afternoon, the story had moved to local radio and the evening news. The search expanded outward from Fort Wayne's southeast side in concentric waves. Additional foot teams in the residential grid, a request to DeKalb County for coordination in case April had somehow been transported east. Canvassing crews working the commercial streets and the bus routes and the school grounds. The tip line that was established by midday on April 2 began receiving calls almost immediately. Most of the calls were useless. All of them were logged. April Marie Tinsley's body was found on the morning of April 4, 1988, 3 days after she disappeared. A farmer working a drainage ditch on the western edge of a soybean field in rural DeKalb County found her. The ditch ran alongside a gravel farm access road, unpaved and unmarked, that connected two county roads across a flat agricultural stretch 20 miles east of Fort Wayne. The land there is exactly what northern Indiana's rural interior looks like at the beginning of April. Wide, flat, and provisional, the field still winter bare, the soil dark with snowmelt and frost heave, the sky enormous and gray, and pressing down on everything with an equal impassiveness. The drainage ditches that line the farm roads there are concrete-lined in some sections and open earthen in others, and in early April they run with cold brown water from field runoff and snowmelt, carrying the smell of iron and mud and the particular mineral coldness of water that has been moving slowly beneath frozen ground all winter. The responding officers from the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene at 8:23 a.m. Fort Wayne police were contacted immediately. A crime scene perimeter was established around the ditch and the gravel road. The field on both sides of the road was cordoned. The gravel surface of the road itself, its disturbed sections, its tire track impressions softened by overnight frost but still legible, was photographed before anyone walked on it. A state police evidence team arrived before noon and began working the scene in methodical quadrants. The physical scene told them several things at once. April was still wearing most of her clothing, though it had been disturbed. Her lavender jacket was present. Her canvas backpack had been placed nearby rather than discarded at a distance. Both of these details were noted and would later be interpreted by investigators as evidence of a particular behavioral pattern, not the frantic disorganization of an impulsive act, but the specific tidiness of someone who had done this with a degree of deliberate attention. The left pink sneaker was still on her foot. The right one was absent. Its absence corresponded to the evidence bag on the shelf back in Fort Wayne. Code E8801, double-knotted, sitting upright on a curb 100 yards east of the last sighting on Hoagland Avenue. The biological evidence collected at the scene was extensive by the standards of 1988 rural crime scene processing. Evidence bags E8802 through E8809 were logged between 10:15 a.m. and 1:47 p.m. by the state police evidence technicians. The biological material recovered included material consistent with sexual assault. The chain of custody was established, signed, and filed. Every bag was sealed in the field before leaving the scene. The evidence was transported to the Indiana State Police Laboratory in Fort Wayne by 3 p.m. Detective Leonard Dwyer of the Fort Wayne Police Department arrived at the DeKalb County scene at approximately 11:40 a.m. on April 4. Dwyer was 44 years old in the spring of 1988, a compact, quiet man with close-cropped gray at his temples and the habit of standing with his arms crossed, not in defensiveness, but in the particular self-containment of someone who was always, quietly, running a private calculation. He had been with the Fort Wayne Department for 19 years. He had worked homicides for 11 of them. He was the kind of detective whose investigative instincts operated below the surface of his demeanor, not cold exactly, but thoroughly inward, processing continuously in a register that rarely broke the surface of speech. He walked the crime scene twice without speaking. The first time was a general orientation. The second time he walked it more slowly, studying the gravel road, the angle of the drainage ditch, the field access paths that branched off the county road to the east and west. He crouched at the ditch for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. He stood and looked down the gravel road in both directions. What he was doing in those two slow circuits of the scene was forming an opinion. The opinion he formed in the first hours at the DeKalb County site would shape every subsequent year of his work on the case. He noted the distance, 20 miles from Fort Wayne, 20 miles from Hoagland Avenue, from the gap in the sight lines, from the upright shoe on the curb. This was not someone who panicked and drove in a random direction. 20 miles on rural county roads in northern Indiana was not an accident. It was a selection. Whoever had done this had either made the choice instinctively, which implied they had driven these roads before, or they had made it deliberately, which implied premeditation. Either way, the distance spoke to familiarity. A stranger passing through Fort Wayne on April 1 would have driven north to 30, or west to 30, or south to 24, the main arterials, the fast exits. They would not have driven east on county roads through flat agricultural land to a gravel farm access road that served no exit and led nowhere useful. This person knew where they were going. Dwyer said nothing to the other officers at the scene. He stood at the perimeter tape for a few minutes after his second circuit, looking at the pale agricultural sky above the flat field. And then he went to find the evidence technician and began reviewing the logged items one by one. He was thorough and patient and methodical in the way that 19 years of hard work produces in the people who are suited to it. In the log of what he reviewed that afternoon, item E8802 was a sealed bag containing biological trace material recovered from the victim's clothing. It was logged at 10:22 a.m. It would become, over the next 30 years, the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case. In April of 1988, no one at the scene knew this yet. It was one bag among 8 on the processing table. The technician sealed it, signed the custody form, and set it with the others. The tip line in Fort Wayne was receiving new calls every hour. Composite sketch requests had been submitted. Canvassing crews were expanding outward across 2 county grids. The investigative machinery of a major child homicide in 1988 was, by any standard, running at full capacity. No suspect emerged from the first 72 hours. No name surfaced that bore serious weight. The composite sketch that was eventually developed, a white male, adult, no distinctive features, described approximately 40% of the adult male population of Allen and DeKalb counties. The ground the investigators covered was real ground. The doors they knocked on were real doors. The tips produced by the line were followed. The work was genuine, and it was not sufficient. In the State Police Laboratory in Fort Wayne, the evidence bag sat in a climate-controlled storage unit, sealed, cataloged, and waiting. On a shelf in the evidence room at the Fort Wayne Police Department, evidence bag E8801, one pink canvas sneaker, right foot, size 2, double knotted, sat in the same sealed condition in which it had been collected 3 days earlier from the curb on Hoagland Avenue. The second shoe was never found. For the remainder of 1988, the investigation into April Marie Tinsley's murder was the most active open homicide case in Fort Wayne's Detective Division. The scale of the effort was, by the standards of a mid-sized Midwestern city in the late 1980s, substantial. 2 detectives were assigned full-time to the case for the first 8 months, with Dwyer as the lead. The tip line received more than 400 calls in the first month and continued receiving calls, in diminishing volume, through the autumn. Each call was logged, assigned a classification, and followed to its stated source. Composite sketches were printed and distributed through the Fort Wayne area, through DeKalb County, through LaGrange and Noble and Kosciuszko counties to the north and east. The sketch appeared in the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette and the News Sentinel, and in both papers more than once. Canvassing teams walked the agricultural roads of DeKalb County in methodical grids, interviewing residents, farm owners, and workers along every route that might have served as the vehicle's approach to the farm access road. They produced a detailed picture of routine traffic patterns on those county roads, who drove them regularly, who had business on them, whose vehicles had been observed there on April 1 and in the days preceding. The picture was comprehensive and inconclusive. The roads were used regularly by dozens of local residents, farmers, and delivery drivers. Everyone who was interviewed had a reason to be there. No one had observed anything unusual on the afternoon of April 1. The victim's family was interviewed multiple times. The neighborhood around Hoagland Avenue was canvassed repeatedly. A sexual offender registry check was conducted against every registered individual within a 25-mile radius, a list that, in 1988, was significantly shorter and less comprehensive than what would have been available in later decades. The names on the list were cross-referenced with the tip line submissions, with the canvassing interview records, with any independent information. None of the cross-references produced a viable suspect. By the spring of 1989, a year after April's death, the active investigative pace had slowed to the rhythm of a case that has been thoroughly worked without resolution. New tips still arrived, less frequently. Dwyer reviewed them as they came. He drove the county roads periodically, not following any specific lead but maintaining a kind of physical familiarity with the geography, a detective's habit of staying in contact with the terrain of an unsolved case. He reviewed the evidence logs, he reread the interview summaries, he produced nothing new from any of it. He did not close the case. The case did not close itself. It simply became the background frequency of his professional life, present always, audible below the frequencies of newer cases, never resolved. What happened in the summer of 1990 was something that no element of the investigative model had anticipated. The message appeared on the interior wall of a wooden equipment barn on a private farm in rural Whitley County, west of Fort Wayne, approximately 12 miles from the Tinsley home on Hoagland Avenue. The farmer discovered it on a Tuesday morning in late July. He had not entered that particular barn in several weeks. The writing was in brown crayon on a section of unpainted board planking near the back wall of the structure, below a small horizontal vent opening that would have admitted just enough light to write by. The letters were block-printed, large and deliberate, with the carefulness of someone writing slowly to be read rather than quickly to be done. I kill April M. Tinsley. Did you find the other shoe? Ha ha, I will kill agent. The farmer called the county sheriff's department. The county notified Fort Wayne. By that afternoon, Dwyer was standing in the barn. He read the message without expression. He read it a second time. He stood back from it and looked at the whole of the writing on the board, the letter sizing, the spacing, the particular quality of the crayon marks which had been pressed firmly enough to show the grain of the wood beneath the pigment. He noticed that the letters were consistent in height but slightly irregular in horizontal spacing, as though written by someone who was either pausing between letters to assess their work or writing without a ruled baseline, compensating by eye. He noticed something else. He noticed what was in the message, the other shoe. The message referenced the other shoe. The Fort Wayne Police Department had not released information about the missing shoe to the public at any point during the investigation. The single sneaker recovered from the curb on Hoagland Avenue, evidence bag E8801, had been collected, logged, and held as evidence. Its existence had been documented internally and had been referenced in interdepartmental communications. It had never appeared in any press release, any newspaper account, or any public statement made by the department about the case. The composite sketches had not referenced it. The tip-line scripts had not referenced it. The detail about the second shoe, that one had been found on the curb and the other had never been located, was, in 1990, known only to investigators, to the victim's family, and to whoever had left April Marie Tinsley in that drainage ditch in DeKalb County. Dwyer stood in the barn for a long time after the evidence team had finished photographing and processing the wall. The barn smelled of dry wood and old oil and the particular mineral staleness of a building that hadn't been fully opened in weeks. The horizontal vent above the planking admitted a pale stripe of afternoon light that fell across the lower portion of the message. The message was a communication. It was addressed to them, to the people looking, and it had been placed here deliberately, in a structure that was not easily visible from the road, in a location that suggested the author knew the property well enough to know the barn would be unoccupied, and to know that the farmer who owned it was not likely to enter it for some time. This was not someone who had stumbled onto a convenient surface. This was someone who had chosen. The state police forensic team photographed the barn wall in detail, took surface samples from the crayon markings, and removed the section of planking for further laboratory analysis. The evidence was assigned the code E9001. It was transported, sealed, and logged to the laboratory. The laboratory's analysis of evidence E9001 consumed considerable time and produced a partial and ultimately unactionable result. The surface of the weathered wood planking had absorbed the crayon pigment in a manner that complicated biological extraction. The forensic science of 1990, specifically its application to DNA profiling from trace materials on organic substrates under field conditions, was not capable of producing a usable genetic profile from the sample. The laboratory's report, filed in the autumn of 1990, documented the attempt in detail and concluded that while biological trace material was potentially present in association with the writing, the available extraction and analysis methods could not yield a profile suitable for comparison purposes. The evidence bag was sealed and shelved. The analysis was deferred, indefinitely pending advances in forensic technology. Dwyer read the laboratory report at his desk in the detective division on a Wednesday afternoon in November 1990. He read it once. He set it on top of the evidence file. He sat for a while doing nothing in particular. He had, since discovering the barn message in July, reorganized his understanding of the case. Before the message, the killer was a shape, an inference built from geography and behavioral evidence, a calculation of familiarity and premeditation that had no face and no name. After the message, the shape had additional dimensions. The killer had remained in the area or had returned to it. He was monitoring the investigation closely enough to know it was still active, and to feel moved to comment on it. He knew a detail that was not public, and he was willing to communicate, to reach out, to taunt, to announce himself, which meant that the compulsion driving him was not simply to escape detection, but to be in some way present. This was not a man who had left. This was a man who had stayed. Through the rest of 1990 and into 1991, no further communications arrived. The investigative work continued in the diminished form of a case that has been worked without success for 2.5 years. The periodic review of tips, the occasional follow-up on names that surfaced from other investigations and seemed worth cross-referencing, the maintenance of contact with the DeKalb County Sheriff and the state police. No new viable leads emerged. In the spring of 1991, Dwyer's divisional commander held a case review meeting for the department's long-running unsolved homicides. The meeting covered 6 cases. For each one, the question was the same: what is the current investigative status, and what resources can realistically be sustained? For the Tinsley case, Dwyer's answer was honest. The investigation had been thorough, had been exhaustive, had produced a substantial volume of evidence, and no prosecutable suspect. A DNA profile had been recovered from the biological material in evidence bags E8802 through E8809. A full genetic profile, which was a significant forensic asset for its time, but the CODIS database was in its earliest operational phase and contained no matching entry. The barn message had been processed and had yielded no genetic material in usable form under current technology. The case was reclassified from active investigation to inactive status. The terminology was bureaucratic. What it meant in practice was that Dwyer would no longer carry the case as a primary assignment. It would not receive dedicated investigative hours. It would not appear on the department's active caseload summary. It would remain officially open. It was never formally closed, never declared solved or resolved, never assigned a final disposition, but its daily life in the detective division had ended. Dwyer returned to his desk after the meeting. He pulled the Tinsley file from his active drawer and held it for a moment. It was a thick file. 2.5 years of work had produced a substantial paper record, hundreds of tip summaries, interview transcripts, evidence logs, forensic reports, interagency communications, the state police lab results, the photographs from DeKalb County and from the Whitley County barn, the chain of custody documentation for 13 distinct evidence items. He organized it into order, placed it in the archival sleeve, and labeled the outside with the case number, the dates, and the classification status. He opened the inside cover and found the notepad page where he had been keeping his running summary observations. He uncapped a pen. He wrote, in the deliberate, unhurried hand he used for observations he wanted to be permanent: subject has remained proximate to investigation. Communication, voluntary and informed. Believes himself safe. Believes case is dead. I believe the subject is known to this community, and I believe he will surface again. He initialed and dated the entry. He closed the file. He walked it down to the records room himself, rather than sending it through the internal routing system. He checked it in with the records clerk, a young woman named Karen, who had been working records for 3 years, and who had the efficient, organizational patience that records work requires. She logged it in, printed the receipt, and placed it in the outbin for shelving. On the shelf in the records room in the climate-controlled basement of the Fort Wayne Police Department, evidence bag E9001, the planking from the Whitley County barn wall, scrawled with brown crayon in block letters, sealed and labeled, sat in its archival position and waited. It did not know it would wait for 28 more years. The barn smell had not entirely left the wood. In a sealed bag in a climate-controlled room in a basement in Fort Wayne, in the dark, on a shelf, the message still read, I will kill Agent. The Fort Wayne Police Department's records room occupied a full sub-basement beneath the main building on Clay Street, 3 stories below street level, temperature controlled to 68 degrees year-round by a mechanical system that had been installed in 1979 and that hummed in a low even register that the record staff stopped hearing after their first week. The shelves ran in long parallel rows under fluorescent light. Every case in the room had a number. The numbers ran into the thousands. The rows ran into the dark. Evidence bag E8802 sat on shelf 11C. Evidence bag E9001 sat on shelf 11C beside it. The Tinsley case file, in its buff-colored accordion folder with the blue tab labeled T, Homicide, PRE 1990, sat in the standing files along the east wall. April Marie Tinsley was 8 years old. Her file was 2.5 inches thick. The years moved forward. In 1991, a pipe in the ceiling above the east wall wept moisture through its insulation for 6 weeks before anyone noticed. The resulting water damage warped the lower 12 inches of the east wall standing files. 6 cases in the lower T section were transferred to plastic bins after a supervisory inspection found mold on their outer folders. The Tinsley file was on the upper shelf of the T section, placed there because it was thicker than most and had been given more room. The lower files were lost. The Tinsley file was not. In 1993, a newly appointed county prosecutor named Gerald Hadley conducted an informal review of pre-1990 unsolved homicides in Allen County as part of a political platform commitment to cold case accountability. His office requested 17 files from the records room. April's file was among them. 2 junior attorneys spent 4 hours with the material, made notes, and returned the file. Their review summary read, "Insufficient forensic technology for further DNA analysis at present. Recommend periodic review as laboratory capability advances. Primary witnesses, aging. Suggest re-interview within 5 years." No re-interview was scheduled. The review summary remained in the file. The county prosecutor lost his re-election bid in 1994 and never returned to the Tinsley file. Detective Leonard Dwyer retired from the Fort Wayne Police Department in the spring of 1997 after 28 years of service. His retirement party was held in the second-floor break room on a Friday afternoon. Someone brought a sheet cake with blue frosting. His captain said that Dwyer had been the kind of officer who believed in the thoroughness of the record, who understood that what a detective writes down outlasts the detective. There were handshakes. There was coffee. His wife, Evelyn, drove him home. He sat in the passenger seat with his retirement certificate rolled in a cardboard tube in his lap and watched Fort Wayne pass outside the window. He thought about the Tinsley file. He had thought about it every working day for 9 years. He would continue to think about it for the rest of his life, which ended in a hospital in Fort Wayne in 2009 at the age of 65 of a cardiac event during a winter cold that had settled in his chest and never quite left. His private case notes, the ones he had kept in a composition book at home, separate from the official file, were disposed of by his daughter during the estate clearing. She did not know what they contained. She put the composition book in a recycling bag with a stack of old utility bills and phone directories. The composition book went into the recycling stream and was shredded. Whatever Dwyer had written in his own hand about April Marie Tinsley was gone. The man who had done it was not gone. In 1996, he was 41 years old. He worked a regular shift. He drove the same roads he had always driven, past the same landmarks, through the same county. He was known by name at the hardware store on Engle Road. He attended the same church he had always attended, in a small white building with an aluminum steeple set back from the road, and he sat in the same pew. He shook hands with the same neighbors. On summer evenings, he sat on his back porch, and the light came down through the same trees, and he listened to the same crickets he had always listened to, and the county around him was unchanged and ordinary, and his. He had taunted the police in 1990, and nothing had happened. He had watched the investigation circle near him and then circle away. He understood himself to be safe. He had understood this for years. He was in the same county as evidence bags E8802 and E89001. He was in the same county as the photograph on April Tinsley's mother's kitchen table. He was 23 miles from the Fort Wayne Police Department's records room. On Saturdays, he went to the grocery store. On Tuesdays, he put his garbage at the curb. The seasons turned. The years accumulated. He aged the same way everyone aged, slowly and then faster. In 1997, the Fort Wayne Police Department's cold case unit, a 2-detective rotation that also covered active caseload and therefore operated on available time rather than dedicated hours, conducted a systematic review of pre-1990 unsolved homicides. The unit had been formally constituted the previous year in response to a national initiative funded through the Department of Justice. The 2 detectives assigned to the unit were given a list of 47 cases. They worked through the list over the course of a fiscal year. They allocated 11 minutes to the Tinsley case. Their summary read, DNA profile obtained 1988 from biological material, E8802. Submitted to CODIS Registry, 1992. No match. Forensic genealogy technology in development, not yet viable for case application. Evidence bags intact and sealed. No new witness material. Recommend archive and resubmit when genealogy database protocols are established for law enforcement application. They signed and dated the summary and placed it behind the 1993 county review letter. 11 minutes. The case had cost April Tinsley 8 years of her life. The Cold Case Review had given it 11 minutes. In the summer of 2004, the dormancy ended. Not for April, not for the investigation. For him. It was late July, and Fort Wayne was in the particular heat that comes to northern Indiana in the weeks when the humidity off the fields thickens the air to something almost textural. In 3 neighborhoods on the northeast side of the city, girls between the ages of 7 and 10 came home from afternoon errands and found folded notes tucked under the handlebars of their bicycles, left while the bicycles sat in driveways or alongside porches during the hour the children were inside. The notes were handwritten in pencil on small sheets of lined paper. The parents who read them immediately called the police. The notes referenced a dead girl by name. They described acts. The language was sexually explicit in a way that left no ambiguity about the author's psychology. They were addressed in one case to the child by name, a name the author could only have known by watching the child, by knowing the neighborhood, by being present. The investigating officers recognized the linguistic signature within 48 hours. The handwriting was submitted for comparison to the 1990 barn wall entry log and the photographic record of the Whitley County taunt. The result came back from the State Forensic Lab in Indianapolis inside a week. The handwriting matched at 14 of 16 measurable letter formation characteristics. The analyst's written opinion read, consistent with the same author, high confidence. It was not legally definitive. It was, for every detective who read it, absolute. He had come back. After 14 years of silence, he had come back, and he had left DNA on the paper because handwritten notes carry skin cells, saliva transfer, oils from the hands. Evidence designation E2004A was assigned to the bicycle notes. All 4 notes were sealed and logged. The DNA extracted from E2004A was cross-referenced against CODIS. No match. The sample was also compared directly to 88802 and E9001. The degradation on all 3 samples limited the comparison to a partial STR profile, 14 loci instead of the standard 20. Of those 14, all 14 matched. The probability figure the lab returned was not conclusive by the legal standard then applicable. It was listed as consistent, highly probable same contributor, below threshold for evidentiary certainty. Highly probable, not provable, not yet. The reinvigorated investigation lasted 8 months. Detectives recanvassed the neighborhoods where the bicycle notes had been left. They conducted interviews. They returned to the original 1988 tip log and worked through names that had never been fully cleared. They came close to several men who lived near the delivery areas. They did not come to John D. Miller, whose name had never appeared in the original tip log, and who was not among the men with registered bicycles or children in the neighborhoods canvassed. By the spring of 2005, the active reinvestigation had dimmed back to periodic review. The notes went into the subarchive alongside E8802 and E9001. The investigation's summary memo, dated May 2005, read, 2004 notes confirm subject is living and has remained in the Fort Wayne metropolitan area. DNA profile consistent across original evidence. And 2004 material, CODIS cross-reference negative. Genealogical database technology not yet viable for law enforcement use. Anticipated 3 to 5 years. Recommend. Annual review. Annual reviews did not occur. In 2009, the Fort Wayne Police Department undertook a digitization project for all pre-2000 case files. The Tinsley file was sorted into the active tier, evidence bags E8802, E9001, and E2004A were physical objects outside the scope of the contract, which covered paper records only. A supplemental memo noted that physical evidence in active case storage should remain in current conditions without transfer. The sub-archive where the evidence bags were housed was, at that time, scheduled for space consolidation, but a departmental hold was placed on any active coded items. The consolidation proceeded everywhere except Shelf 11C, an oversight that in this single instance was not an oversight at all. In 2013, the Allen County Prosecutor's Office convened a cold case review panel as part of a statewide initiative. The forensic consultant, a woman named Dr. Sharon Ellard, spent 40 minutes with the evidence documentation. She wrote in the panel's summary report, DNA profile on file, partial STR, 14 loci, maintained across 3 evidence designations from 1988, 1990, and 2004. CODIS negative. Forensic genealogy via commercial ancestry database not currently approved for law enforcement use in Indiana. Based on trajectory of genealogy database expansion and anticipated legislative clarification of access protocols, this case may warrant genealogy database resubmission in 5 to 7 years. Evidence preservation is critical. Do not consolidate or transfer E8802, E9001, E2004. Recommend formal resubmission review in 2018 to 20 window, 5 to 7 years. The Tinsley case was designated pending, technology review, 2018. It would be the last institutional action on the case for 4 years. The years between 2013 and 2017 passed in the sub-basement of the Fort Wayne Police Department, the same way all the years since 1988 had passed. In the dark, in silence, at 68 degrees, on shelf 11C. The barn smell in E9001 had faded by then. The climate control had leached it out over decades. What remained in the sealed bag was not barn, not crayon, not wood. What remained was the molecule-level residue of a crime, stripped of everything except its chemical architecture. The molecule-level residue was sufficient. It would always have been sufficient. The world had simply not yet built the instrument capable of reading it. On the kitchen table in the house, on Reed Road, the photograph had not moved. Linda Tinsley was 67 years old in 2017. Her hair had gone from brown to silver in the years since 1988, and the silver had a quality of light in it that her brown hair had never had. She was a small woman, and age had made her smaller, but not fragile. There was a particular steadiness to the way she moved through her kitchen, a settled, practiced economy of motion, the way that people who have survived deep grief sometimes move, as though they have learned to conserve themselves. The photograph of April sat in its frame on the kitchen table, where it had sat for 29 years. April in her school picture, 3rd grade, wearing the yellow cardigan, her dark hair in 2 braids, her smile slightly lopsided because she had lost a front tooth the week before the photograph was taken. Linda dusted the frame every Saturday morning. She made her coffee, and she sat at the table, and she looked at her daughter's face, as she had done on 10,000 mornings, and the coffee in her mug cooled without being touched. She had never described it as waiting. She did not have language for what it was. It was something simpler than hope, and more durable than hope. It was the refusal to accept that April's story had an ending that could not be named. The clock on the wall above the stove marked the seconds with a soft metronomic tick. April looked at her from the photograph with a slightly lopsided smile, and Linda Tinsley looked back, and the house was very quiet. Detective Ava Moreno joined the Fort Wayne Police Department's cold case unit in January of 2017 on a temporary assignment that became permanent within 6 months. Because she was the kind of investigator who could not be moved out of a job she believed needed doing. She was 38 years old, 11 years on the department, the last 4 in the Crimes Against Persons Division. She had the dark, careful eyes of someone who reads documents the way some people read landscapes, looking for what is missing rather than what is there. Her hair she kept pulled back when she worked, a habit so automatic that she sometimes arrived home in the evening and found it still pinned without remembering pinning it. On the wall above her desk in the cold case unit's shared office on the 3rd floor, she had taped a single printed sheet of paper, 8.5 by 11, black text on white. It was a statistical summary published by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, tabulating the number of child homicides in the United States that remained unsolved after 25 years. The figure was not small. She had read it once the day she taped it up. She had not needed to read it again. Its function was not informational. Its function was to be there, on the wall, every morning when she came in. In October of 2017, her supervisor gave her a stack of 31 pre-2000 unsolved homicide files involving victims under the age of 14, and told her to prioritize them by current forensic potential. The stack included cases from 1968 to 1998. She took them to her desk and worked through them over 2 weeks, pulling the sub-archive evidence documentation for each one, and mapping the available biological material against current forensic capability. She found the Tinsley file on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of October. The sub-archive was 1 level below the main records room, accessed through a stairwell that smelled of concrete and old paper and the specific metallic cold that comes from climate-controlled spaces built in the 1970s. Moreno carried a yellow legal pad and a flashlight even though the fluorescent lights worked, because the lights at the back of the sub-archive took a minute to warm up, and she had learned not to wait for them. Shelf 11C was at the far end of the back row, The evidence bags were exactly where the chain of custody log said they would be. She found them behind a larger bin of physical evidence from a 1994 shooting case, pushed to the back of the shelf in the way that smaller items migrate backward, over years of someone reaching past them. She pulled all 3 bags to the front of the shelf and read their labels. E8802, Tinsley, AM 0401, 88, biomaterial, sealed. E9001, Tinsley, AM 04, 090, barn wall plank, scrawl sample, sealed. E204A, Tinsley, AM 0729, 04, bicycle notes X4, DNA-bearing material, sealed. She stood in the back of the sub-archive with the 3 evidence bags on the shelf in front of her and the yellow legal pad open in her hand, and she did not write anything for a long moment. She looked at the dates: 1988, 1990, 2004, 3 samples, 3 decades, all intact, all sealed, all waiting on a shelf in the dark for an instrument that had not existed when they were collected. She thought about what she was looking at. She thought about the 2013 panel summary, which she had already read and reread at her desk upstairs, Genealogy Database Resubmission in 2018 to 2020 window. It was 2017. She was early. She photographed all 3 bags with her phone, documented their positions on the shelf, wrote down the chain of custody log numbers, and carried the legal pad back up the stairs. At her desk, she pulled the full Tinsley case file and read it from the beginning. She read the original incident report, time-stamped April 4th, 1988, 7:14 a.m. She read the forensic inventory from the scene. She noted the single entry that read, 1 pink canvas sneaker, right foot, size 2, left sneaker not recovered. She read Detective Dwyer's investigative summaries, chronologically, from April 1988 through his final entry in 1991, when the case was reclassified. She read his interview notes. She read the 1990 supplemental report about the barn on the farm in Whitley County, the photographic documentation of the scrawled message, the transcribed text, I kill April and Tinsley, did you find the other shoe? Haha, I will kill agent. She read Dwyer's closing entry, written when the file was reclassified to inactive. Subject has remained proximate to investigation. Communication voluntary and informed. Believes himself safe. Believes case is dead. I believe the subject is known to this community, and I believe he will surface again. She stopped on that sentence. She read it a second time, and then a third. Leonard Dwyer had written that in 1991, he had been right. The subject had surfaced again in 2004 with the bicycle notes. Dwyer had not lived to see it. He had written the sentence into a file that would not be opened again for years after his death, on a shelf in a basement, and he had been right. She thought about what it meant to be right in a way that no one read for 30 years. She kept reading. The 2004 bicycle notes were the piece of the file that changed the temperature of the room. She had read the 2005 summary memo at her desk before coming to the sub-archive, but reading the original reporting from 2004, the initial complaint calls, the parent's statements, the handwriting comparison analyst's opinion made it immediate in a way the summary did not. The author of these notes had been within arm's reach of children in Fort Wayne in the summer of 2004. He had watched them. He had learned at least one of their names. He had tucked paper under their bicycle handlebars while they were inside their houses, and then he had walked away. The DNA on the paper was degraded but present. The handwriting matched the barn taunt at 14 of 16 measurable characteristics. The 2005 summary had assessed this as highly probable same contributor, below threshold for evidentiary certainty. Moreno's first interior assessment was precise. The degradation was the obstacle, not the material. The material had held for 16 years between 1988 and 2004. It had held for 13 more years between 2004 and this afternoon. The question was not whether the profile could be extracted. The question was whether the current generation of forensic genealogy labs could work with a partial STR profile expanded to its maximum recoverable loci. The answer, based on what she had read about the developing capability at the forensic labs now working with law enforcement, was yes. Not certainly. Probably. Enough to submit. She turned to the second interior assessment, the one that was harder to name. The 2004 notes were a gift. He had not understood that he was giving it. He had come back because something in him needed to communicate, needed the police to know he was still here, still free, still the same person who had killed April Tinsley on Good Friday 1988. He had left that communication in the form of handwritten notes on paper, which carry skin cells and oils and saliva transfer and partial fingerprint material, and the entire biological record of a human being's existence. He had been throwing away who he was, one contact at a time, for 30 years. The sub-archive had been collecting it. She requested a formal case review from her supervisor on October 31, 2017. The review request cited the 2013 panel recommendation, the 3 intact evidence designations, and the current legal and scientific viability of forensic genetic genealogy following the department's consultation with the Indiana State Police's Forensic Division and its review of the law enforcement access protocols established earlier that year. Her supervisor, Lieutenant Ray Caswell, read the request over his lunch and told her to write the submission authorization for genealogy database access and bring it to him that afternoon. She wrote it in 40 minutes. She specified 3 evidence samples for submission: E9001, the barn wall plaque residue, which was the oldest material and the most institutionally documented; E8802, the original 1988 biological material collected at the scene; and E2004A, the 2004 bicycle notes, which carried the most recent deposit and the least degraded profile of the 3. She named the submitting laboratory and requested independent confirmation from a second laboratory. She estimated a return timeline of 6 to 12 weeks. Lieutenant Caswell signed the authorization on the afternoon of November 14, 2017. Moreno packaged the 3 evidence bags under the original chain of custody protocol, added the transfer documentation, and shipped them the following morning via secure evidence courier. She came back to her desk and sat down. Outside the 3rd-floor window, Fort Wayne was moving through an ordinary November afternoon. The trees on Clay Street had gone bare. The sky was the flat gray of a season that had made up its mind. She had submitted the authorization on November 14, 2017. The results were pending. She had done everything she could do. She waited. The samples arrived at the Forensic Genealogy Laboratory on November 19, 2017. They were signed into the laboratory receiving chain by a specimen intake technician who noted the condition of all 3 evidence bags, sealed and intact, with original chain of custody documentation intact, in the intake log, and assigned them a laboratory batch designation. The facility processed law enforcement evidence submissions under a protocol that prioritized child homicide cases. The batch was placed in the priority queue. The analytical lead assigned to the case was a forensic genomicist who had worked on a dozen cold case submissions and understood the specific challenge of extracting a workable STR profile from material that old. She had also read, in the case briefing Moreno had included with the submission, about the 2004 bicycle notes and their partial 14 loci matched to the original 1988 material. 14 loci across 17 years of independent storage. Matching. That told her something important about the preservation conditions and the original deposit quality. She began with the bicycle notes. The extraction process from the bicycle note material took 4 days. Her team used a modified low copy number extraction protocol that amplified degraded genetic material without introducing amplification artifacts, a technique that had been refined over the previous decade specifically for aged forensic samples. The bicycle note paper yielded skin cell residue, saliva transfer at the fold line of the note, and a partial fingerprint oil deposit along the right margin. The initial STR profile extraction returned 22 loci. Of the 22, 18 were complete allele pairs. 4 showed partial degradation that could be resolved through confirmation runs. She ran the confirmation. The final profile contained 21 full loci and 1 partial. She designated it the working primary profile. She cross-referenced against CODIS. No match. The system had not changed its answer since 1992 and 2005. She cross-referenced against the 1988 material and the 1990 barn wall residue. Both returned profiles at the same 14 loci that the 2004 sample had already confirmed. The new extraction extended the comparison to 17 common loci across all 3 samples. All 17 matched. 3 evidence deposits, 3 decades, 17 loci. 1 contributor. She picked up the phone and called Moreno's direct line to report the profile status. "I have a working profile," she said. 21 full loci. "I'm going to the database." The genealogy database submission was the step that converted a confirmed DNA profile into a human identity. The protocol worked as follows. The unidentified profile The 21 loci working profile was submitted to a genealogy database containing genetic records voluntarily uploaded by individuals tracing their ancestry. The database search used a genetic similarity threshold that returned all individuals in the database who shared a significant fraction of their genetic markers with the unidentified profile. A match at that threshold corresponds roughly to a second cousin relationship or closer. The database submission was filed on December 4, 2017. The return took 9 days. On December 13, 2017, the analyst received the database results and sat down to begin the genealogical analysis that would convert a list of genetic relatives into a specific generation of a specific family. The database had returned 47 potential matches above the threshold. She began sorting them. The genealogy analysis proceeded in layers, working from the most distant genetic relatives toward the closest, mapping the family trees of the matching individuals and identifying which branches of which families could have produced a male contributor in the correct age range. Someone born between 1945 and 1965, given the behavioral and investigative profile Moreno had included in the case briefing. 31 of the 47 matches were ruled out within the first week by geographic distribution. Their family trees placed their male relatives in the correct generation in states that had no documented connection to northeastern Indiana in the relevant years. This was not definitive exclusion. People move, but geographic plausibility was a necessary working criterion. She flagged these 31 as low priority and focused on the remaining 16. Of the 16 remaining matches, she mapped the family trees to their second and third generation male members born between 1945 and 1965. The mapping produced 38 candidate individuals. She submitted the extended analysis to the confirming second laboratory on December 21, 2017, and received their independent mapping in the third week of January 2018. The two analyses agreed on 36 of 38 candidates. 2 candidates were eliminated by documentary evidence. One had died in 1981. One had been incarcerated in a Michigan facility in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which was inconsistent with the geographic profile of the crime. 36 candidates remained. She narrowed by surname. The genetic relationships among the 47 database matches converged on 3 primary surnames in their family trees. All 3 concentrated in Allen County and the adjacent counties of Whitley, DeKalb, and Noble. The northeastern Indiana geographic cluster that placed them precisely within the investigative radius of the 1988 crime and the 2004 bicycle notes. 3 surnames, 3 families, 1 geographic cluster. She called Moreno. "I have 3 surnames," she said, "all Allen County or adjacent. I need 2 more weeks." The final genealogical elimination took 13 days. Of the 3 surnames, the first was eliminated by age distribution. The male members of the correct generation in the most closely matching branch had all relocated to the Cincinnati area before 1980, and none had documented connections to Fort Wayne. The second surname narrowed to 2 candidate individuals in the correct generation. Both were living. One was 61 years old and resided in Kendallville, Noble County. The other was 59 years old and resided in Graybill, Allen County. The third surname produced 1 candidate in the correct generation, age 63, who had grown up in Whitley County and relocated to Fort Wayne proper. He had 2 arrests on his public record, both nonviolent, and no documented connection to the specific geography of either the 1988 crime or the 2004 bicycle deliveries. She ran the third surname candidate against the geographic constraints and placed him in low priority status. She returned to the second surname's 2 candidates. The Kendallville candidate had lived in Noble County continuously since 1974, according to documentary sources. Noble County bordered DeKalb County, the county where April had been found, but it placed the subject 26 miles from the Hoagland Avenue abduction site and without documented presence in Fort Wayne proper. He was not excluded. He was ranked second. The Grabble candidate was different. His name was John D. Miller. He was 59 years old. He had lived in Grabble, Allen County, Indiana, since at least 1983. Grabble was a small, unincorporated community in the northeastern corner of Allen County, 8 miles northeast of the Fort Wayne city center. It was 11 miles from Hoagland Avenue. It was 18 miles from the Whitley County barn where the 1990 taunt had been scrawled on a wall. It was 14 miles from the neighborhoods in northeast Fort Wayne where the 2004 bicycle notes had been delivered. Every geographic parameter of the case pointed at an origin in the northeastern quadrant of Allen County. Grable was in the northeastern quadrant of Allen County. She cross-referenced the name against the 1988 tip log, which Moreno had included in the case documentation. John D. Miller did not appear. He had never been interviewed. He had never been on the list. The investigation had not found him in 1988, not in 1990, not in 2004. He had been 23 miles from the Fort Wayne Police Department's records room for the entire duration of the investigation, and no investigator had ever knocked on his door. She compiled her final report. The probability figure took one additional day to finalize across both laboratories. The working profile, 21 loci, 3 independent evidence designations, consistent across 3 decades, was assessed against the genealogical match pathway linking the unidentified contributor to the Miller family branch. Probability of familial match, 98%. Confirmed by 2 independent laboratories. The report was transmitted to Moreno's secure evidence file on Tuesday, February 6, 2018, at 5:26 in the afternoon. Moreno was at her desk when the file notification appeared. She had been working on a separate case, a 1994 case involving a woman from Decatur, when the notification icon lit in the bottom corner of her screen. She finished the sentence she was writing by hand, set the pen down, and opened the file. She read the laboratory header, she read the profile confirmation, she read the probability figure, 98%. She read the name, John D. Miller, Grable, Allen County, Indiana. She read it a second time. She looked at the geographic cross-reference, Grable, 11 miles from Hogland Avenue. She read the notation that Miller had not appeared in the 1988 tip log. She sat with that for a moment. The 30 years of distance between this name and the file in the sub-archive, the 30 years during which he had been in the same county, the same quadrant of the same county, less than half an hour's drive from the basement shelf, where the evidence had been waiting. She set the report on her desk. She did not move for a long time. The third-floor office was quiet around her. The November light had been gone for hours. The fluorescent overhead caught the edge of the printed report on the desk, and the room was very still. And she sat in the middle of it with the name in front of her and understood what the name meant and what it would now require. She thought about Detective Dwyer's final log entry, which she had read and reread until she could recite it. I believe the subject is known to this community, and I believe he will surface again. He had not surfaced. He had stayed exactly where he was. Ordinary. Church-going. Tuesdays at the curb. He had not surfaced. She had found him. She picked up the phone. The genealogy result was not evidence. Not yet. Moreno understood this with the particular clarity of an investigator who has learned the difference between knowing a thing and being able to prove it in a court of law. The 98% probability was a statistical argument about familial relationship, not a direct DNA comparison. It placed the unidentified contributor in the Miller family branch with mere certainty. It did not place a specific swab of John D. Miller's DNA against the profiles in the evidence bags. That direct comparison required direct material. Direct material required a collection event. There were 2 ways to collect DNA from a subject who had not consented to testing and who was not under arrest. The first was a court-ordered biological sample, which required a warrant, which required probable cause at a standard that a genealogy probability argument would not yet satisfy in an Indiana court. The second was a trash pull. Under Indiana law and under the governing federal precedent, material placed in a trash receptacle at the public-facing boundary of a property, at the curb, in a public bin, in a communal disposal area, was abandoned property. Abandoned property required no warrant for collection. It required only a chain of custody protocol, a secure evidence container, a documented collection time, and 2 witnesses. On the morning of July 9, 2018, Moreno and her partner Detective James Ortega drove an unmarked department vehicle to a residential street in Grable, Indiana. The morning was warm in the way that northeastern Indiana mornings are warm in early July. The thick, still warmth that arrives before the wind picks up when the humidity off the surrounding field sits close to the ground and the air carries the smell of cut grass and road dust. The sky was the pale, even blue of a cloudless summer morning before the sun has climbed high enough to bleach it white. The bare trees of March had become full canopied, and their shadows lay long and cool across the lawns along the residential streets. The town was quiet at that hour in the way that small, unincorporated communities are quiet on July mornings. A few trucks on the main road, a school bus long since absent for the summer, the sound of a screen door somewhere down the block, and then silence again. The Miller residence was a single-story house on a tree-lined residential street, built in the late 1960s or early 1970s, with white aluminum siding that had been replaced sometime in the past decade, and a poured concrete driveway running to a one-car attached garage. The yard was orderly. A bird bath stood in the front lawn near the driveway, empty and summer pale. The porch light was off. The front curtains were closed. At the end of the driveway, 2 garbage cans sat at the curb. Collection day in Gravel was Wednesday. The cans had been put out the evening before. Moreno pulled the vehicle past the house and parked 1 block north behind a utility truck from the County Electric Cooperative. She and Ortega sat for 4 minutes and observed the street. Nothing moved. No vehicles in or out of the driveway. No observable activity at the windows. Ortega got out of the vehicle with a clean paper evidence bag and latex gloves and walked down the sidewalk at a pace that would have been indistinguishable to any observer from a neighbor checking the mail. He reached the Miller driveway. He opened the lid of the first garbage can. He worked through its contents systematically, using the gloves without disturbing the placement of items. He found what the investigative assessment had indicated was likely to be present. Used personal hygiene materials in sealed plastic bags, which is common practice in residential refuse throughout the rural Midwest. He removed 3 items fitting the collection criteria. He placed them in the evidence bag. He sealed the bag. He wrote the collection time and marker on the seal, 8:47 a.m., July 9, 2018. He noted his own name and Moreno's as witnesses on the label. He walked back to the vehicle at the same unremarkable pace. The entire collection had taken 9 minutes. They drove directly to the Department Evidence Processing Unit and logged the collection into chain of custody as evidence designation E2018M1, assigned to the Tinsley cold case file, from the Miller residence to the evidence log, 1 hour and 22 minutes. The laboratory submission went out the following morning. Moreno had called the analyst the night before and told her what was coming. "If this is who we think it is," Moreno said, "I need the comparison completed as fast as the protocol allows." "Give me 10 days," the analyst said. She delivered in 8. The laboratory extracted a complete, unambiguous STR profile from the material in E2018M1. There was no degradation. The material was fresh. The extraction was clean, 24 loci, all 24 allele pairs complete. This was not the partial profile of a decades-old biological deposit from a ditch in DeKalb County or a crayon scrawl on a barn wall in Whitley County. This was a full genetic record, modern, unambiguous, the most legally and scientifically reliable form of DNA evidence the technology could produce. She ran the comparison. She compared the full profile from E2018M1 against the working primary profile from the combined analysis of the 3 original evidence designations. The 21 loci profiles she had extracted from the 2004 bicycle notes and confirmed across the other 2. The comparison ran against all 21 shared loci. All 21 matched. No degradation flags, no exclusionary allele pairs, no statistical hedging in the report language. The results section of the confirmation report read, "Direct DNA comparison between E2018M1 and the established working profile confirms a match at all 21 tested loci. Results are consistent with identity, not family relationship, but direct identity, between the donor of E2018M1 and the contributor of the evidence profiles." She sent it to the confirming second laboratory. Their independent comparison returned in 48 hours. It agreed in full. The final probability figure was calculated and confirmed on July 17, 2018. Probability of match, 98%. Confirmed by 2 independent laboratories. The report was 9 pages. It contained the extraction methodology, the loci data tables, the degradation analysis from the original samples, the comparison methodology, the statistical model, and the conclusion section. The conclusion section was 43 words. It read, "The DNA profile extracted from evidence designation E2018M1 is consistent with direct identity to the contributor of the profiles obtained from the original evidence designations. This conclusion is made with 99.98% confidence." 43 words for 30 years. Moreno received the final report at her desk on the morning of July 17. She read it from the first page to the last without stopping. She read the conclusion section twice. She thought, briefly and precisely, about what she was holding. Not triumph. She had learned from enough cases that the feeling preceding an arrest was not triumph, nothing so simple or clean as that. What she felt was something quieter. the specific quality of a silence that follows a very long noise. 30 years of unanswered question. 29 winters at Linda Tinsley's kitchen table, the photograph on the cloth, and on a shelf in the dark, in a sealed bag, the molecules that had been waiting since April of 1988 for the world to build the instrument capable of reading them. The world had built it. She had the answer that Leonard Dwyer had believed existed, but could not find. She had the name that the 1988 tip log had never contained. She had the probability figure that converted forensic inference into legal certainty. She had the direct comparison that converted a genealogy match into a prosecutable case. She picked up the phone and called Lieutenant Caswell. "I need to draft an arrest warrant," she said. She began writing it that afternoon. 23 miles southeast of the Fort Wayne Police Department, in a single-story house with white aluminum siding and a bird bath in the front yard, John D. Miller ate breakfast at his kitchen table on the morning of July 17, 2018. The morning was warm and pale beyond his windows. He drank his coffee while it was hot, a habit he had always had. He ate what he usually ate, in the order he usually ate it, at the time he usually sat down. He had lived in this house for decades. He knew the sound of every room in it. He knew the sound of the street outside, the occasional truck, the particular quiet of a July morning in Grable when the collection truck had already come and gone earlier in the week and the day had not yet filled itself with noise. The collection truck had come on Wednesday. He had brought the cans back to the driveway after it passed. He had no reason to think about the cans. He had no reason to think about Fort Wayne. He finished his coffee. He set the mug in the sink. He put on his work jacket and opened the door to the garage. Outside, the sky was pale blue. The full-leafed trees along the street stood in the still summer air. The investigative machinery was already moving toward his door. It had been moving since November, since the laboratory had opened the evidence bags and found what 3 decades of institutional silence had preserved. It had been moving since a detective had walked down a sidewalk in Graybill on a July morning and made a 9-minute collection that cost him nothing and cost John D. Miller everything. He did not know any of this. He got in his truck and drove to work, and the pale Indiana morning closed behind him as it always did. Unremarkable, ordinary, indistinguishable from any other morning he had driven this road in 30 years of driving it. The warrant application was on Moreno's desk. The warrant was signed in Allen County by a judge at 11:47 in the morning. It named John D. Miller of Grable, Indiana. It cited a DNA match probability of 98% confirmed by 2 independent laboratories. It cited a trash pull collection dated July 9, 2018, from the Grable residential curb, yielding biological material that had been processed and confirmed against the evidence profiles. Ava Moreno held the warrant in both hands for a moment after it was returned to her. Then she folded it into the case file and began making calls. The logistics of the arrest took 4 days. They had to be right. They had been 30 years getting to this warrant, and Moreno was not willing to allow a procedural failure, a wrong turn, a missed radio check, a neighbor who called ahead, to fracture what the laboratory had built. She met with the sheriff's office of Allen County and 2 investigators from the Fort Wayne Metro Homicide Unit. They studied satellite imagery of the Grable residence. They noted the side door, they noted the detached garage, they noted the narrow side street that ran alongside the property, and the field that opened behind it. 2 approach corridors were designated. The lead vehicle would hold on the north end of the block. A secondary vehicle would come in from the southeast along the side road. A forensic team would stage 3 houses back until Moreno gave the signal. A perimeter officer would take a position east of the garage before dawn. There would be no announcement until Miller was in sight. The briefing ended. Moreno drove home. She did not sleep more than 2 hours. She was at the staging point before dawn on a Monday. The sky was the particular dark of an Indiana summer morning. An hour before first light, not fully black, but a bruised indigo that offered no definition to the tree lines or the rooftops. The air was thick and warm, already holding the humidity that would make the afternoon unbearable. Somewhere in the fields east of town, something moved through tall grass. A truck passed on the county road 2 blocks distant, and its headlights swept briefly across the staging area and vanished. The officers spoke very little. The radio traffic was clipped and minimal. Everyone had been assigned a position, and everyone knew it. By 5:45, all vehicles were in place. The lead vehicle sat dark and still on the north approach, engine off. The secondary unit had come in along the side road, and the last of the dark headlights extinguished a half-block back, and now sat at the edge of the property line. The perimeter officer had taken his position east of the garage and reported via radio in a single word. confirmed, and went quiet. Just before 6, the sky began to shift. The indigo above the rooftops bleached slowly toward gray, and then toward the pale amber gray of a July Indiana dawn, the color of old road signs, of faded barnwood, of a sky that has not yet decided what kind of day it intends to be. Light came in flat from the east. The dew on the grass along the side road caught it and held it briefly, and then let it go. Moreno sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle and looked at the house. It was a modest house on a quiet street. A single-story, pale exterior that had bleached nearly white over the years. Aluminum storm door on the front entrance. The driveway ran along the south side of the property toward the detached garage, and a length of garden hose had been coiled neatly near the garage door. The trash cans stood at the end of the drive. They had been put out the week before for the collection that had delivered the warrant, now folded in Moreno's case file, and brought back in after. The yard was trim and unremarkable. There was a concrete bird bath near the front corner of the house, tilted slightly to one side. The house looked like every other house on the street. A light came on in the kitchen. Moreno watched the square of yellow light appear in the kitchen window. She did not move. She watched for 30 seconds, then keyed the radio. "We have activity, southwest window, first floor. Hold positions." The radio returned silence. A few minutes later, the side door, not the front door, the side door facing the driveway, opened. John D. Miller stepped out onto the single concrete step in front of the side entrance. He was dressed for work, canvas jacket, dark trousers, work boots. He had a travel mug in his right hand and his keys in his left. He pulled the door shut behind him and turned toward the driveway. He saw the vehicles. He stood completely still for a full 3 seconds. He did not drop the mug. He did not step back. He did not look for an exit. He looked at the lead vehicle on the north end of the block, and then at the secondary unit to his left along the side road, and something moved across his face that was not panic and was not surprise in the ordinary sense of the word. It was closer to recognition. Not the recognition of a man who has been caught doing something he believed he had hidden. The recognition of a man who has for a long time understood that something was eventually going to arrive and has been living in the interval between the understanding and the arrival, and the interval has now closed. He stood on the step and looked at the vehicles, and his expression was almost composed. Moreno was already out of the vehicle, badge on her jacket, her voice level and carrying in the still summer air. "Mr. Miller, stay where you are. Keep your hands where I can see them." He looked at her. He set the travel mug down on the concrete step beside him, with a careful, deliberate motion, as though he was placing it somewhere he intended to retrieve it later. He raised his hands. 3 officers moved from the vehicles toward the driveway. Miller did not resist and did not speak. He turned when asked. He placed his hands behind him without instruction, as though anticipating the request. The handcuffs were placed and confirmed. The warrant was read aloud by the lead officer. His name, the charges, murder in the first degree, the case designation, the authority of the Allen County Court. Miller looked at the pavement in front of his work boots while the warrant was read. When the officer finished, Miller lifted his head and looked briefly at Moreno. Then he looked away. He was walked to the secondary vehicle. He had to bend slightly to get in. The door was closed. Across the street, a porch light came on. A figure appeared briefly in a doorway. An older man in a gray undershirt holding the screen door half open, looking at the vehicles and the officers and the handcuffed figure being walked to the car. He did not come outside. After a moment, he let the screen door close. The forensic team moved up from the staging area. The house would be searched under a second warrant issued the same morning. The garage would be processed. The side door Miller had come out of was photographed in place before anyone touched the handle. The street returned to stillness. The amber-gray light of the July morning had brightened slightly, enough now to see the dew on the bird bath, the garden hose coiled at the garage door, the travel mug sitting on the concrete step where Miller had set it down. He had not finished his coffee. Within 3 hours, the news had reached Grabble and the wider Fort Wayne metropolitan area. By mid-morning, it had gone regional. By afternoon, it was national. The name John D. Miller meant something different to different people who heard it that morning, but in all cases, the initial response was the same. A brief, involuntary stillness. A recalibration. Because Miller was not a transient. He was not a stranger who had passed through Fort Wayne in 1988 and vanished. He was a man who had lived in Allen County for the entirety of the 30 years between the crime and the arrest. He had attended church. He had gone to work. He had waved from driveways. He had been a known face in a community that thought of itself as a community, the kind of small Indiana town. where known faces were one of the things that made it feel safe. A former neighbor who had lived 2 houses from Miller for 11 years told a reporter, in a voice that still carried the specific disorientation of that morning, "He brought in our trash cans once when it rained. I wasn't home, and he just did it. I thanked him the next day." She said it without any particular emphasis. She said it the way a person says something that they are still trying to find a way to understand and have not yet found one. A man who attended the same church as Miller for 7 years said he had never had a reason to think anything was wrong. He sat with that sentence for a moment. Then he said, "That's what I keep coming back to, that I never had a reason." These were not uncommon responses. The texture of the community's reckoning in the days after the arrest was defined by this specific, vertiginous quality. Not horror exactly, though horror was present, but the particular disorientation of retrospective reexamination. People were combing backward through years of ordinary interactions, looking for something that had been invisible, trying to understand how an absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence. The case file for April Marie Tinsley had always contained the killer's own assertion that he was known to the community. He had written it himself on a barn wall in 1990 in the handwriting of a man who was confident he would not be found. "Did you find the other shoe? Haha, I will kill again." He had been right about not being found. For 30 years, he had been wrong about the permanence of it. The interrogation room in the Allen County building was on the 3rd floor. It was a standard institutional space, fluorescent strip lighting that cast everything in a flat, shadowless white, a metal table with a bolted leg, 2 chairs on opposite sides, a camera mounted in the upper corner with a small red indicator light that blinked in a slow, steady rhythm throughout the session. Miller was brought in mid-morning. He had been processed, photographed, fingerprinted, the administrative machinery of formal arrest completed. He sat down across from Moreno without being asked twice. He placed his hands on the table in front of him, loosely folded. He was read his rights and said he understood them. He said he did not want a lawyer present. Moreno sat across from him and let the silence run for a moment before she spoke. She had been in interrogation rooms for 22 years. She had learned early that there were 2 kinds of silence: the silence of a person who had nothing to say, and the silence of a person who was deciding how much of what they had to say they were willing to give. Miller's silence was the second kind. He was looking at the table, but he was not absent. He was present in a contained, controlled way that suggested he had spent time thinking about what this conversation might eventually look like. She asked him about April Tinsley. He said he didn't know who that was. She set a photograph on the table, the school photograph from April's 2nd grade year, the one with the blue backdrop and the slight self-conscious smile that every child produces when a photographer says smile and they are trying to do what they've been told. Miller looked at the photograph. His expression did not change. He said, "I've seen her picture. It was in all the papers. I don't know her." She set a second photograph on the table, the evidence summary photograph from the trash pull collection. Items retrieved from the public collection point at the edge of his gravel driveway. Miller looked at this photograph for a longer moment. "That's my trash," he said. "People put things in my trash. I don't know what's in my trash." Moreno set the laboratory report on the table. She did not explain it. She let him read. He read slowly. His hands on the table did not move. The red light on the camera blinked its slow, steady rhythm in the corner. The fluorescent light gave everything the same flat quality, the same absence of shadow, the same institutional neutrality that makes everything in a room like that feel equally factual and equally relentless. When he finished reading, he set the report back on the table with the same careful, deliberate motion he had used to set his travel mug on the concrete step that morning. He did not look at Moreno immediately. He looked at the wall to his left for a moment, and his expression was the expression of a man making a private assessment, balancing something he had held for a long time against the weight of what was now on the table in front of him. The balance was not close. He had known it was not close since the moment he saw the vehicles on his street. There was a long silence. The camera blinked. The fluorescent light made no sound at all. Then Miller put both hands flat on the table and looked at Moreno and said, "I was there. But it wasn't like they're going to say it was." His tone was not a protest. It was not a plea. It was the tone of a man who had been rehearsing a version of this sentence for 30 years and had finally arrived at the moment to deliver it, and the delivery was as flat and careful and composed as everything else he had done that morning. Moreno did not respond immediately. She let the sentence stand in the fluorescent light of the room and mean exactly what it meant. The evidence in the case of April Marie Tinsley had a biography of its own, a 30-year passage through institutions, archives, floods that didn't reach it, purges that didn't include it, reviews that didn't see it, and a laboratory that finally did. It had begun as a list on an evidence inventory form dated April 4, 1988. 3 days after a Good Friday afternoon on Hogland Avenue, 3 days after a child did not come home. The form was typed on a standard template, the carbon copy curled slightly at the top corner because the building's humidity ran high in spring. It listed 14 items, assigned sequential codes beginning with E8801. E8801, one girl's pink canvas sneaker, right foot, size 2, laces double knotted, recovered upright from the curb on Hoagland Avenue. One shoe, only one. The left shoe had not been found that day. It would not be found in the days that followed. It would not be found at all. E8802, biological trace material recovered from the victim's clothing at the DeKalb County scene, photographed before removal and photographed again during processing. Placed in a sealed evidence bag at 3:48 p.m. on April 4 by Detective Leonard Dwyer and initialed by a second officer in attendance. The bag was heat-sealed. It was placed on a metal shelf in the evidence room, where it would remain for the next 29 years in the particular institutional silence that is the atmosphere of places where no one has a reason to open the door. The evidence chain ran from that shelf to a cold case review request submitted in October 2017 to a laboratory that specialized in forensic genetic genealogy. The chain was reconstructible because someone, in 1988, had been careful. Leonard Dwyer had been careful. The bags were sealed correctly. The chain of custody documentation was complete. The samples had degraded. 30 years of temperature variation and humidity had done what they always do, but not beyond recovery. The laboratory received the submission. They documented the received condition of each evidence bag. They photographed the seals before breaking them. They extracted what they could. The biological trace in E8802 yielded a partial STR profile, the foundation on which the genealogy analysis would be built. It was the other submission that closed the circuit. The July 9, 2018. Trash pull from the gravel curb. Items that had been handled by one person, discarded by one person, and collected by 2 investigators on a Tuesday morning when the collection truck had already come and gone. The laboratory processed the fresh material against the partial profile extracted from the original evidence. The result, confirmed by 2 independent laboratories, stated 98% probability of donor match. Random match probability, 1 in 4. 3 trillion. The evidence chain ran from the ditch on a DeKalb County farm road in April 1988 to a driveway in gravel in July 2018 to an interrogation room table where a man set a laboratory report down with the same deliberate care he had used to set a travel mug on a concrete step and said, "I was there." 30 years of distance and institutional entropy and improbable preservation. And the chain held. Miller entered his guilty plea on December 4, 2018. In the Allen County Superior Court, the proceeding was conducted in a courtroom with high windows that admitted the thin gray light of an Indiana December morning. The gallery was full. The case had accumulated 5 months of national attention since the July arrest, and the gallery held journalists and community members, and in the second row from the front on the left side, a woman who had been waiting for this moment since the spring of 1988. The allocution was read by Miller in a flat, procedural voice. That on or about April 1, 1988, he did unlawfully and knowingly kill April Marie Tinsley, age 8, in DeKalb County, Indiana. He said the words as they were written. He did not elaborate. He did not look at the gallery. The prosecutor read the evidence summary for the record, the biological trace from the original 1988 material, the forensic genealogy analysis identifying Miller's family line, the trash pull collection confirming identity, and the prior taunting communications, the barn wall message recovered in 1990, the bicycle notes recovered in 2004, both confirmed through forensic comparison to contain biological material consistent with the same donor profile. The prosecutor read through these items in the steady, document-anchored voice of an officer of the court, presenting a complete chain, each link in the chain held. Before the formal sentencing phase began, the prosecutor read one additional item into the record. It was a log entry, original document, dated April 7, 1988, written by Detective Leonard Dwyer in a handwriting that had grown slightly less precise with fatigue by the end of the 4th day of the investigation. The entry read, I believe the subject responsible for this crime is known to this community and is living within it. I believe that someone saw something or knows something and has not come forward. I believe this case will not be resolved quickly, and I believe it will be resolved eventually. I want this entry to reflect that my assessment was filed and that I intended to continue working this case until it was closed. The courtroom was very still when the prosecutor set down the sheet. Then the prosecutor said, "That entry was written in 1988. Today, in 2018, this court can confirm what Detective Dwyer could not yet prove. This case is closed." The gallery behind the bar did not make a sound. The sentence was 80 years. The judge delivered it. Miller would be eligible for parole consideration only after serving a minimum of 60 years, which, given his age at sentencing, was functionally equivalent to a life sentence. The language of the sentencing order was precise and institutional, and contained within its precision a completeness that 30 years of open case file and unanswered question had not been able to provide. In the second row of the gallery, April's mother did not change her expression when the sentence was read. She had been very still for the entirety of the proceeding. She had been very still in a way that suggested she was holding something carefully. Not grief exactly, because grief implies surprise, and there had been no surprise for her in any of this. She had known, in the way that some people simply know, from the time April did not come home on Good Friday, that this day existed somewhere in the future and that she had to remain intact until she reached it. She remained intact. When the proceedings were over and the courtroom began to release itself from the sustained, formal silence of the sentencing, she did not stand immediately. She sat for a moment in the thin December light. Then she stood, and a woman beside her, a daughter, a friend, someone who had also been waiting, put a hand on her arm, and she allowed it. She had been asked in the days leading up to the plea what she hoped to feel when it was over. She had thought about the question for a long time before answering. "I always knew somebody knew," she said. That sentence had been true for 30 years. It was still true. The fact that it had also been answered did not make it less true. It made it, in a way that was hard to describe, more true, because the knowing had been vindicated, and the waiting had not been pointless, and the patience required to survive from April 1st, 1988 to December 4th, 2018, had produced an outcome that could be described in a sentencing order and read into a court record and archived in a case file that would now finally be stamped closed. The community reckoning that followed the July arrest and deepened through the December sentencing was not, for Grable or Fort Wayne, a simple or brief process. It did not resolve into a clear lesson. It continued in the way that genuine reckonings continue, producing new questions each time it appeared to have reached a conclusion. The practical fact at the center of the reckoning was this: John D. Miller had lived in Allen County for the entirety of the 30 years between the crime and the arrest. He had not gone underground. He had not changed his name. He had not moved to another state or another country. He had attended church and gone to work and waved from driveways and put his trash cans out on Tuesdays and brought them back in. He had done this for 3 decades, in a community small enough that people knew his face and associated it with nothing more troubling than ordinariness. Former neighbors were interviewed in the months following the arrest. Their responses shared a common quality: the quality of retrospective vision, of looking back at years of uneventful contact and trying to identify, in hindsight, the thing that had been invisible in the present. "He was just a neighbor," one woman who had lived near him for 14 years said. She paused. "I don't know what that's supposed to mean anymore." A man who had worked at the same facility as Miller for a period in the early 2000s said that Miller had been quiet and competent and unremarkable. He did his work, and he went home. That was all I ever saw. A former church member said that she had sat in the same pew section as Miller for years and had never had a conversation with him that exceeded pleasantries, but had never had a reason to want a longer one. She said, "You think you would know. I think everybody thinks that. That you would know." She stopped. "You don't know." The case of April Marie Tinsley had always been described in the 30 years before the arrest as an unsolved case, as though the absence of a conviction meant the absence of a subject, the absence of a person around whom the facts had been waiting to cohere. But the subject had been present for all 30 years. He had been present at the church and at work and in the neighborhood. He had been the face that people knew and did not have a reason to think about. The reckoning was the reckoning of proximity. It did not produce a simple lesson. It produced a question that remains, in the community and in the broader cultural conversation that followed the case's resolution, genuinely unanswered. What does it mean to know a place and the people in it when a place can contain something like this for 30 years without marking itself? The search of Miller's property had been conducted in the days following the July arrest. A team of 12, working over 3 days, had covered the residence, the garage, the outbuildings, and a strip of land along the rear property line. They had used ground-penetrating radar on the soft ground near the eastern fence. They had recovered additional biological material from the garage interior consistent with the known profile. They had documented the space methodically, evidence code by evidence code, the bureaucratic inventory that converts a private domestic space into a public forensic record. They had not found the left shoe, pink canvas, size 2, left foot, listed on the original inventory as E8801. B, condition unknown, location unknown. The search teams moved through the soil east of the garage and along the back fence line and covered a grid that extended 200 yards beyond the property boundary into the neighboring field. They found nothing that corresponded to the description. The shoe was never recovered. It is possible that it was disposed of separately, in a location that was never identified. It is possible that it did not survive 30 years of Indiana winters and wet springs and the ordinary biological processes that return organic material to the earth. It is possible that it exists in a place that the investigators simply did not reach. The case file closes without it. The evidence summary notes the absence plainly, in institutional language that makes no editorial comment. Left shoe, E8801. B. Not recovered. Not everything that was taken can be returned. The science recovered a name and a conviction. It did not recover a shoe. Moreno was in the evidence room when the original biological material was formally transferred to the closed case archive on December 12, 2018. The sealed bags that had waited on the shelf for 29 years had given what they had to give. She initialed the transfer documentation and set it on the return pile. John D. Miller died in custody on September 4, 2025. He had served 7 years of his 80-year sentence. The cause of death was reported as natural causes. He was 70 years old. The case file received its final institutional notation. Status: closed. Conviction: Miller, John D. Date of conviction: December 4, 2018. Decedent: Miller, John D. September 4, 2025. The file was moved to the permanent archive. The distance between April 1, 1988 and December 4, 2018 is 30 years and 8 months. It is 4 children's lifetimes. It is the length of an adult career. It is long enough that the investigators who worked the case in its first years retired and died before it closed, and the technology that solved it did not exist in the year it should have been solved. This distance is the case's truest fact. Not the DNA match, though the match is extraordinary. Not the guilty plea, though the plea is the formal and necessary container for what justice required. The truest fact is the duration, 30 years, and 8 months of a family carrying something that should have been taken from them by an institution with the capacity to take it, and wasn't, because the institution arrived at its capacity too late. April's mother waited 30 years and 8 months to hear a sentence read in a courtroom. She waited through the years when the case was open and active and the leads ran out. She waited through the years when the case was cold and the file sat in its archive, and the annual April anniversaries came and went, and the phone did not ring with news. She waited through the years when a new unit reopened the file and submitted the evidence, and ran the genealogy analysis, and the laboratory took the months it took, and the arrest came, and the plea came, and the sentencing came. She was present for all of it. She carried it through all of it. This is what the case cost, not in the abstract, in the specific, continuous, daily weight of a woman who knew that someone knew and had to hold that knowledge in the absence of institutional confirmation for 3 decades. The technique that solved April's case is called forensic genetic genealogy. It was applied, in the form used here, for the first time in a major case in 2018. It works by extracting a DNA profile from evidence material, submitting it to consumer genealogy databases under voluntary research provisions, identifying relatives of the unknown profile through shared genetic markers, and triangulating backward through family trees to the most probable donor of the original sample. It is not magic. It is patient, methodical, labor-intensive science, dependent on the existence of consumer genealogy databases that did not exist in 1988, dependent on laboratory protocols that were not standardized until the 2000s, and dependent on the preservation of evidence material across decades of institutional transition. In the years since April's case helped establish the method as a legitimate investigative tool, forensic genetic genealogy has been used to reopen and resolve more than 500 cold cases in the United States. Cases from the 1970s, cases from the 1980s, cases where the evidence sat in archive for 40 years, preserved in the particular institutional luck that kept one bag on a high shelf during one flood in one building where the lower shelves were lost. The method arrived when it arrived. Not in 1988, when the evidence was fresh and the investigation was active, and a name might have been retrieved without 30 years of distance. Not in 1997, when Leonard Dwyer was still alive and might have seen the result he had always believed was possible. It arrived in the form it arrived, in a laboratory in 2018, working on a submission that had waited 29 years to be properly opened. This is not a comfortable fact. That the technology and the timeline did not align until after so much of the cost had already been paid is not a vindication of patience as a strategy or of institutional delay as an acceptable condition. It is simply what happened. The technology and the case met when they met, and the meeting was late, and the lateness is part of the record. Leonard Dwyer did not live to hear his 1988 log entry read aloud in a courtroom in December 2018. He had retired from the Fort Wayne Police Department in 1997 and died in 2009 at the age of 71. He had written his closing case note in the particular handwriting of a man who intended it to be read, not by whoever opened the file next week, but by whoever was standing in a position to close it. He had not known when that would be. He had known it would be. He wrote, "I believe this case will not be resolved quickly, and I believe it will be resolved eventually." The prosecutor who read those words in 2018 said, "Before setting down the transcript, Detective Dwyer was right about everything." The gallery heard it in silence. Some of the people in that gallery had known Dwyer. Some of them were too young to have known him. All of them understood what it meant to be right about something and not live to have the rightness confirmed. His words confirmed themselves. The evidence boxes from the case of April Marie Tinsley are in the Allen County Archives. Status: closed. The boxes contain the material record of 30 years, the original evidence bags from 1988, the supplemental submissions from 1990 and 2004, the laboratory reports from 2017 and 2018. The plea documentation from December 2018, they contain the bureaucratic biography of a case that ran from a ditch on a county road in early April to a courtroom in December and took 30 years to make the trip. Somewhere in those boxes, on a form dated April 4, 1988, is the evidence inventory that lists 14 items in Leonard Dwyer's handwriting. Near the top of the list is E88011, pink canvas Nike sneaker, right foot, size 2, laces double knotted, recovered upright from the curb on Hogland Avenue. Below it, a line for its pair. The entry reads, E8801B, left shoe, not recovered. It was never recovered. If you believe that the truth deserves to outlast the silence that was placed over it, subscribe so we can keep returning to the cases that time tried to close. And if this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Every person who stays to the end of a case like this is part of the reason it gets told.